The sun hung low in the morning sky, casting a golden glow over the city of Los Angeles. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the distant hum of traffic. Along the boulevard, lined with luxury boutiques and high-end restaurants, stood Crystal Shine Auto Spa, a place where only the wealthiest dared to bring their prized vehicles. Michael Williams pulled his black pickup truck into the lot, his movements slow and deliberate. The truck was clean but far from luxurious, sticking out like a sore thumb among the Ferraris and Bentleys that gleamed under the morning light. He killed the engine, resting his hands on the steering wheel for a moment. Through the windshield, he could see the sleek glass panel entrance of the auto spa, where attendants in sharp, navy blue uniforms moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Customers in designer suits and sunglasses leaned against the reception counter, handing over the keys to their six-figure cars. Michael inhaled deeply and stepped out of the truck. His navy blue work coveralls were pressed, his boots sturdy but worn. To the casual observer, he looked like any other mechanic, someone who spent his days elbow-deep in grease and exhaust fumes. But Michael carried himself with quiet confidence, his posture straight, his gaze calm. The moment he started walking toward the entrance, he felt it. The stares, the hesitation, the quick, judgmental glances. It started with the receptionist, a young woman with sleek blonde hair, whose polite smile faltered when she saw him approaching. Her eyes flickered down to his uniform, and in that single second, Michael knew exactly what she was thinking. Then came the security guard by the door, shifting his weight as if deciding whether he should intervene. And finally, the manager. A man in his mid-40s, dressed in a perfectly tailored dress shirt, stepped out from behind a reception desk. He had the air of someone who knew he was in charge, or at least someone who needed everyone else to know it. His name tag read Tony Brooks, General Manager. Tony took one look at Michael and exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone already laced with impatience. Michael kept his expression neutral. "I'm here for a service." Tony's eyebrows lifted slightly. "A service?" He glanced at the truck behind Michael and let out a quiet chuckle. "You're joking, right?" Michael simply stared at him. Tony sighed and crossed his arms. "Look, buddy, I think you might be in the wrong place. This isn't some quick wash-and-go joint. We provide high-end detailing for high-end clients." Michael tilted his head slightly, and Tony let out a sharp breath through his nose, as if he couldn't believe he had to explain. "And our premium services start at over $1,000. We don't," he gestured vaguely at Michael's coveralls, "usually service work vehicles." From behind him, two attendants, Jason and Carl, exchanged smirks. Carl, a lanky guy with a neatly trimmed beard, nudged Jason and whispered something, loud enough for Michael to hear. "Bet he just walked in to ask for a job." Jason stifled a laugh. "Or to steal free samples of wax for his beat-up truck." Michael remained still, his heartbeat steady. He had expected this. There's always the same. People judge too quickly. They assumed. They looked at a man like him, dressed the way he was, arriving in a truck instead of a Rolls-Royce, and instantly decided his worth. He could have corrected them right then and there. Could have walked into the back office, pulled up the ownership documents, and shattered their illusions in an instant. But that wasn't the point. "Are you refusing service?" Michael asked, his voice calm. Tony let out a short laugh. No. We're just selective about the clients we take on. We have a certain image to maintain. You understand, right?" Michael met his gaze, saying nothing. Tony sighed dramatically. "Fine. If you really want a premium package, I hope you've got the cash to cover it." Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick money clip, peeling off a few crisp $100 bills. "That enough for a deposit?" For the first time, Tony hesitated. The attendants stopped laughing. The receptionist, who had been pretending not to listen, quickly looked away. Tony cleared his throat, forcing a smirk back onto his face. All right. You're serious. That's cute." He gestured toward the side of the building. "Pull around back. That's where we handle our work trucks." Michael said nothing. He simply tucked the remaining cash back into his pocket and turned on his heel, heading back toward his truck. Inside the auto spa, the moment Michael was out of earshot, the snickering started again. Carl leaned against the counter, shaking his head. "Can you believe that guy? Walking in here like he owns the place." Jason chuckled. "Yeah, And did you see that old-ass truck? No way he actually drops money here. Bet he scrounged up those hundreds just to mess with us. Tony sighed, rubbing his temple. Let's just get this over with. He'll be gone soon enough. The receptionist, who had remained silent through the entire exchange, bit her lip. For a brief moment, she considered speaking up, saying something, anything, but the words never left her mouth. Instead, she simply went back to her computer screen, pretending nothing had happened. Back outside, Michael leaned against his truck, his fingers tapping idly against the hood. He could still hear the faint laughter from inside. They hadn't even tried to be subtle. He sighed, shaking his head slightly. It never changed. No matter how much success he had built, no matter how many businesses he owned, there would always be people like them. People who saw a man like him in work clothes and assumed they knew his story. But they had no idea. No idea who he was. No idea what was about to happen. Because in just a few hours, every single one of them was going to learn a lesson they would never forget. And Michael, he was going to enjoy every second of it. Michael pulled his truck around the back of Crystal Shine Auto Spa, where the contrast between the polished front and the grimy rear entrance was stark. The back lot was less pristine. Oil stains dotted the pavement, and discarded rags lay crumpled near a row of industrial-grade cleaning machines. This was where they sent people they didn't respect. A heavy metal door swung open with a loud creak, revealing a spacious garage with bright fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly in the silence. Inside, a few employees milled about, some wiping down freshly detailed vehicles, others leaning against tool carts, chatting. At the sight of Michael's truck rolling in, their conversation stuttered to a halt. One of them, a muscular man with tattooed forearms, wearing a navy polo with a company logo, let out a low whistle. Whoa, hold up. Who let this thing in? The second employee, a wiry guy with a shaved head, snickered. Seriously, does that even qualify as a car? Or is it just 4 wheels and a prayer? Michael parked without reacting. He had learned long ago that some men bark the loudest when they feel the smallest. He stepped out of the truck, his boots landing firmly on the garage floor. Client request, said a third worker, a younger man with a clipboard. He looked unimpressed. Manager says full detailing. Tattooed arms guy, Carl, arched an eyebrow. Full detailing. This. He gestured toward the truck like it was an insult to the building. Come on, man, we got actual luxury cars waiting. Michael leaned against the truck, arms crossed. They're a problem. Carl blinked, as if momentarily thrown off by the calm confidence in Michael's voice. He expected defensiveness, maybe embarrassment. Instead, he got unshaken certainty. Shaved head guy, Jason, grinned, stepping closer. No, man. No problem. Just never seen a work truck get the VIP treatment. It's kinda cute. Behind him, another employee chuckled under his breath. Michael let the words hang in the air, watching as they all exchanged knowing glances. They were testing him, waiting for a reaction, an opening. He gave them nothing. Let's get started, he said, his voice even. Jason rolled his eyes. Yeah, don't block the entrance. He motioned lazily toward a washing bay. Pull it in. Michael stepped aside, letting them take over. He watched as they moved, noticing how little care they put into the process. Normally, the staff at Crystal Shine worked with surgical precision, treating their clients' vehicles like newborns. But here, they handled his truck like a piece of junk. Carl sloppily tossed a rag over his shoulder before yanking a high-pressure hose toward the truck, muttering something under his breath. Water blasted against the vehicle, the force almost excessive. Jason, meanwhile, wandered over to a counter where microfiber towels were stacked, deliberately taking his time. He wasn't in a rush to do his job. Michael's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained where he was. This wasn't just about him. This was about every person who had ever been underestimated. Every worker who had been dismissed because they weren't dressed the part. Every man or woman who had been talked down to simply because someone assumed their worth based on appearance alone. This moment wasn't just his. It was bigger than that. Carl huffed dramatically. Man, I don't even know why we're wasting time on this thing. No way a guy like this actually tips. That earned another wave of laughter from the employees nearby. Michael exhaled slowly, keeping his hands tucked in his pockets. They had no idea who they were mocking. No idea that in just a few hours, They would be standing in this same garage, their faces drained of color, their voices tight with shame. No idea that the man they were ridiculing owned everything around them. Pushing too far. As the cleaning continued, Jason and Carl continued their casual mockery, sometimes whispering, sometimes making just loud enough comments for Michael to hear. Man, I bet he barely scraped together enough for this service. Think he took out a payday loan just to afford it? Or maybe he's just trying to impress someone. Poor guy doesn't know money can't buy class. Michael watched as Carl grabbed a bottle of detailing spray, flipping it idly in his hands before looking at Jason with a sly grin. You know what? Let's give the guy some extra service. Jason chuckled. What are you thinking? Carl tilted his head toward the back of Michael's truck. He probably hauls junk in that thing. Maybe we should freshen it up a bit. Michael immediately understood what was about to happen. Carl strode toward a shelf stacked with scented sprays and grabbed a bright pink bottle labeled Luxury Rose Mist, a fragrance used for high-end sedans, not rugged work trucks. Jason snickered. Oh man, that's gonna smell fancy. Before Michael could say anything, Carl leaned into the open truck bed and unleashed several heavy sprays of the perfume. The sickly sweet scent billowed up in an artificial cloud, soaking into the interior fabric. The laughter erupted before the mist had even settled. Dude, now it smells like a rich old lady's closet. Or a Vegas lounge full of wannabe millionaires. Jason wiped tears from his eyes. Man, I hope he enjoys that all day. The other workers were laughing so hard they didn't notice the change in the air. But Michael noticed, and he had finally had enough. No more laughs. Michael stepped forward, his movement smooth but deliberate. The laughter died down almost instantly when they saw the look in his eyes. Not anger. Not rage. Something worse. Absolute certainty. The kind of certainty that made a man rethink everything he had just done. Carl still had the perfume bottle in his hands, his fingers gripping it loosely. For a brief moment, he seemed frozen, his smirk faltering. Jason, sensing the sudden shift in the mood, cleared his throat. Hey man, don't take it so serious. It's just a joke. Michael stared at him, expression unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. I got a meeting with the owner later today, he said, his voice low and steady. You think he'd be impressed with this kind of service? Jason blinked, thrown off by the question. Carl laughed nervously, though there was a trace of unease behind it. Man, the owner doesn't even come around. He's some rich guy who probably sits in a mansion all day. Michael held his gaze, and for the first time that morning, silence settled over the garage. The laughter was gone. The jokes had died. Something about the way Michael stood there, unwavering and unbothered, made them uneasy, and they had no idea why. But they were going to find out. Very soon. The scent of luxury rose mist still lingered in the air, thick and suffocating, a stark contrast to the crisp, industrial scent of car wax and tire polish that usually filled the garage. Michael stood still, his expression unreadable, his presence suddenly weighing heavier than anyone had expected. Carl shifted uncomfortably, still clutching the perfume bottle, his fingers tapping against the plastic. Jason's smirk had faded, replaced by a forced casualness as he busied himself wiping non-existent dust off a nearby workbench. The laughter was gone. The garage, once filled with smug grins and whispered jokes, had grown strangely quiet. And yet, they didn't know why. Michael wasn't yelling. He wasn't throwing a fit. He wasn't even glaring. That was what made them nervous. He simply stood there, arms loose at his sides, his posture relaxed but firm. His words hung in the air like a challenge. I've got a meeting with the owner later today. You think he'd be impressed with this kind of service? Jason cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle. Man, the owner doesn't even come here. Trust me, we know if some rich guy was about to walk in. Carl nodded quickly, eager to regain control of the conversation. Yeah, no offense, man, but guys like you. You don't get meetings with the owner of a place like this. Michael just stared at them. Not a flicker of emotion. Not a single giveaway. The silence stretched. Something about the way he carried himself, the unwavering steadiness in his voice, the calm certainty in his posture, made them uncomfortable. For the first time since this whole thing started, doubt crept in. The moment of hesitation. Carl turned to Jason, lowering his voice just slightly. Hey, who is meeting with the owner today? Greg mentioned something about a big meeting. Jason hesitated, shifting his weight. I don't know. Probably some investor or something. Why? Carl glanced at Michael again, unease flickering across his face. Just, never mind. The receptionist, Rachel, walked in through the garage entrance, her eyes scanning a clipboard. She had been silent all morning, pretending not to hear the jokes, the snide remarks. But now, as she glanced up and met Michael's eyes, something shifted. A flicker of recognition. A realization just beginning to form. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then stopped. Instead, she turned toward Carl and Jason, her voice clipped. Tony wants you both inside. No. Carl scoffed. What for? Rachel shrugged, her fingers tightening around the clipboard. He didn't say. Just go. Jason rolled his eyes but tossed his towel onto the nearest cart. Bet he wants us to prep some VIP's car or something. Carl smirked, throwing a final glance at Michael. Guess we'll leave you to enjoy that luxury floral experience, huh? They disappeared through the door, their footsteps echoing against the concrete. Michael didn't move. Rachel hesitated before stepping closer. You're not really here for a detailing service, are you? Michael turned his gaze to her. Her breath caught. He didn't need to answer. She already knew. Meanwhile, inside the office, Tony Brooks paced. The general manager of Crystal Shine prided himself on maintaining flawless customer service. His reputation depended on it. So when he had gotten the call from corporate this morning, informing him that the new owner was arriving for an unscheduled visit, his stomach had twisted into knots. He had immediately rallied the team, barking orders to ensure everything looked pristine. He had instructed the front staff to be on their best behavior, the garage team to move efficiently. He had planned everything. But he had no idea where the owner was. His phone buzzed. A message from Greg, the district director. Owner should already be there. He wanted to observe first before formally introducing himself. Make sure everything is perfect. Tony's stomach dropped. He was already here. A slow, creeping realization settled over him. If the new owner had arrived without checking in, that meant he had been watching, observing, seeing everything. Tony wiped a hand down his face, forcing himself to remain calm. He turned as Jason and Carl walked into the office, still smirking from their little joke in the garage. What's up, boss? Jason asked, plopping into a chair. Tony exhaled sharply. Listen, we got someone very, very important here today. Someone you do not want to piss off. Carl frowned. Who? Tony checked his watch. The new owner. He's been here all morning. Carl and Jason exchanged a glance. Jason let out a forced laugh. Wait, what? Carl shifted in his seat. You mean some investor or something? Tony shook his head. No, I mean the guy who bought this place. The one who's about to decide if half of us keep our jobs. The color drained from Jason's face. Carl sat up straighter. You sure he's here? Tony clenched his jaw. Greg said he wanted to watch first. Said he wanted to see how things run before making any decisions. Silence. Then Jason swallowed hard. You don't think we, ran into him already, do you? Tony stopped pacing, turned slowly, and for the first time that day, his gut told him something was very, very wrong. Back in the garage, Michael glanced at the large wall clock. Almost time. Rachel was still staring at him, her grip on the clipboard tightening. Before she could finish, the office door slammed open. Tony stormed out, Jason and Carl trailing behind, their faces suddenly pale. Their eyes locked onto Michael. Everything about them, their swagger, their arrogance, their smirks, was gone. Because now they understood. And Michael, he just smiled. He said smoothly, straightening his sleeves. Looks like it's time for my meeting. The garage had fallen into a thick, suffocating silence. Carl and Jason stood frozen, their faces a shade paler than before. Tony, usually so full of authority, now seemed rigid, calculating, trying to piece together what had just happened. And Michael, he stood there unmoved, not smug, not angry, just watching. Like a man who already knew the ending to a movie everyone else was still figuring out. Tony cleared his throat, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. So, you're here for the meeting. Michael dusted off his sleeves, adjusting his posture. That's right. Jason's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. Carl shoved his hands into his pockets, shifting uncomfortably. Right, Tony said, his voice a little too tight. He nodded toward the office. Let's talk inside. Michael didn't move. Instead, he took a slow step forward, glancing at Carl and Jason. They should come too, he said simply. Tony hesitated. That's a good idea, Michael interrupted, his voice even final. I insist. There was no room for argument. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive. Tony forced another stiff nod. Right, fine. Let's go. Rachel, still standing nearby with a clipboard clutched against her chest, took a small step back as they moved toward the office. Before Michael followed, he glanced at her. She met his gaze, and he saw it. The realization. The understanding. She hadn't participated in the mockery, but she had stood by, saying nothing. And yet, in that moment, Michael didn't look at her with judgment. Just quiet acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked inside. Inside the office. The air in Tony's office was stifling. Michael took a seat at the head of the table, a deliberate choice, watching as Tony hesitated before sitting across from him. Carl and Jason stood near the door, shoulders tense. Tony forced another strained chuckle, wiping his palms against his slacks. So, Michael, was it? Michael leaned back slightly. Michael Williams. Tony nodded too quickly. Right. So, what can I do for you? Michael exhaled slowly. You already know. Tony froze. Michael's eyes never left him. You got a call this morning, didn't you? He asked, his voice calm, controlled. Tony opened his mouth, closed it. Michael continued. They told you the new owner would be here, that he wanted to observe the workplace before making any decisions. He tilted his head slightly. And now you're sitting here, trying to figure out if that's me. Tony's lips parted slightly. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. Carl and Jason weren't breathing. Michael gave him a moment to process it. Then he dropped the final piece. I own this place, he said simply. The words hit the room like a gunshot. Carl's jaw actually fell open. Jason looked like someone had just pulled the floor out from beneath him. Tony blinked once, twice. Then suddenly, he let out another awkward chuckle. Wait, what? That's a joke, right? Michael didn't blink. Do I look like I'm joking? Silence. Deep. Cold. Deafening. Tony visibly swallowed. You're telling me you bought Crystal Shine 6 months ago? Yes. Jason let out a stunned breath. Carl blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of it. Wait, but you're a mechanic? Michael finished for him. Carl flinched. Jason rubbed a hand over his face. Oh my God. Michael folded his hands on the table. Now, let's talk about what I observed today. Tony immediately sat up straighter. Michael, listen, whatever happened, I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. Michael lifted a single hand. Tony shut up. And then Michael spoke. And with every word, the weight in the room grew heavier. The reckoning. I watched my employees treat a customer like garbage today, Michael said, his tone even unshaken. I watched them assume his worth based on what he was wearing, based on the car he drove, based on their own arrogance. Carl gripped the edge of his chair. Michael's eyes flicked to him, then to Jason. You too, he said evenly. Had a lot to say today, didn't you? Jason's hands curled into fists in his lap. You thought it was funny, Michael continued. The way you handled my vehicle. The way you mocked me. The way you laughed when you sprayed perfume into my truck. Carl's head snapped up, panic flashing across his face. Jason let out a shaky breath. Michael leaned forward slightly. Tell me, he said, voice quiet. Is it funny now? Carl quickly shook his head. No, sir, we didn't mean. Michael lifted a hand. I'm not interested in excuses. Carl clamped his mouth shut. Jason looked like he was going to be sick. Tony shifted. Michael, listen, these guys. Michael's eyes flicked to him. And you? Tony froze. Michael tilted his head slightly. You stood there, he continued. Watched them. Heard them. You could have stopped it at any moment. Tony opened his mouth, closed it. Michael's voice never wavered. But you didn't, he finished. The room felt colder now. Michael slowly stood. Jason and Carl tensed. Tony finally spoke again, desperate. Michael, listen, Michael met his gaze, then said the words that made every single one of them stop breathing. You're fired. The silence that followed Michael's words was absolute. Tony Brooks sat frozen in his chair, his confident demeanor completely shattered. Jason and Carl, who had spent the entire morning laughing at the mechanic they thought was beneath them, now looked like men who had just watched their entire world collapse. Michael stood tall, his presence commanding the room in a way that no shouting ever could. He didn't need to raise his voice. The weight of reality did all the talking for him. Tony blinked rapidly, his brain scrambling for an escape. Wait, Michael, let's be reasonable. Michael didn't react. Tony licked his lips. Listen, I get it. This morning, that wasn't our best moment. But we run a good business here. We cater to high-end clients, Michael raised a hand. Tony shut up instantly. The power had shifted so quickly, it was almost dizzying. Michael's voice remained calm. What part of you're fired was unclear. Tony's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. Michael, please pack your things, Michael cut him off. By the end of the day, I don't want to see you here again. Tony stared. For the first time in years, he was powerless. And he knew it. Carl and Jason's reckoning. Carl and Jason weren't breathing. They had come into this room laughing, smirking, treating Michael like an insignificant nobody. Now they were seconds away from losing everything. Jason's throat bowed. Sir, listen, Michael's eyes snapped to him. You what? Jason swallowed hard. You regret it? Michael asked, his voice even. Or do you just regret getting caught? Jason flinched. Carl suddenly stood up, speaking fast. We didn't mean anything by it, sir. It was just jokes, you know? Stupid jokes. Michael tilted his head. Jokes. Carl nodded rapidly. Yeah, it was dumb, I get it, but we didn't mean it. We were just messing around. Michael took a step closer. Carl shut up immediately. Michael watched them both. Then he did something unexpected. He sighed. Not an angry sigh. Not a frustrated one. A sigh that sounded like disappointment. And somehow that was worse. You know what the worst part is? Michael said quietly. Neither man answered. Michael's voice was steady, calm, sharp as a blade. The worst part isn't that you judge someone by their clothes. Jason swallowed. The worst part isn't even that you humiliated a customer. Carl's hands clenched into fists. The worst part, Michael leaned in slightly, voice lowering, is that you both felt so comfortable doing it. You didn't hesitate. You didn't stop to wonder if it was wrong, because it never even crossed your mind that the man you were mocking could be someone worth respecting. Carl exhaled shakily. Jason looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. And that was the lesson. The real punishment. Not getting fired. Not losing money. But knowing that they had revealed their own character in the worst possible way. And there was no taking it back. Michael straightened. You're both on probation, he said finally. One more mistake, and you're gone. No warnings. No second chances. Carl nodded so fast it looked painful. Jason let out a breath of pure relief. Yes, sir. Understood. Michael gave them one last glance. Get back to work. They scrambled out of the office, moving like men who had barely escaped a sinking ship. Tony's last stand. Tony was still sitting there, watching it all unfold. He had built his entire career on power, on control. Now, he was a spectator in his own downfall. Michael turned back to him. I'm only saying this once. This business is going to change. No more arrogance. No more hierarchy. No more treating employees like they're disposable. Tony laughed bitterly. You can't run a high-end business without exclusivity. Michael held his gaze. Watch me. A long silence stretched between them. Then Tony pushed himself up, shaking his head. Fine. You want me gone? I'm gone. He brushed past Michael toward the door, then paused. A final, desperate attempt to regain some control. You really think you can do this without me? Michael smiled. Yes. And with that, Tony walked out, his reign officially over. Rachel's choice. Michael turned. Rachel was still there, watching, waiting. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Michael said, "You didn't join in." Rachel exhaled softly. "No, but you didn't stop it either." She winced. Michael's voice wasn't cruel, just honest. "Why?" Rachel hesitated. Then she finally said, softer than before, "Because I was afraid." Michael nodded once. It was the truth, and that mattered more than any excuse. "I'm promoting you to assistant manager," he said. Rachel's eyes widened. "W what?" Michael folded his arms. "I need someone who understands what's wrong with this place. Someone who saw it firsthand." Rachel still looked stunned. I don't know if I deserve that." Michael shrugged. "Then prove me wrong." A long pause. Then, for the first time that day, Rachel smiled. "Okay," she said quietly. "I will." Michael nodded. Good. A new beginning. The air in the office felt different now. Lighter. Like something toxic had finally been cleared away. Michael took a deep breath, checking his watch. It wasn't even noon, and already the world had changed. The garage floor of Crystal Shine Auto Spa had never been this quiet before. The usual background chatter, the casual banter between employees, the low hum of arrogance that had once defined this place, gone. Michael walked through the space at an unhurried pace, his eyes scanning everything. The workers who had once smirked at him now couldn't meet his gaze. Jason and Carl were back at work, moving with a noticeable tension in their shoulders, hyper-aware of every movement. The easy arrogance they had flaunted just hours ago had vanished. Michael said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough, setting the new standard. At the reception desk, Rachel stood behind a counter, flipping through a logbook. When Michael approached, she straightened. "Everything's running smoothly," she said, voice steady. "No issues so far." Michael nodded. "Good." She hesitated, fingers tightening around the pen she held. "People are nervous." Michael lifted an eyebrow. "Because they have to do their jobs right?" Rachel let out a small chuckle. "Because they don't know what's coming next." Michael exhaled through his nose. He knew exactly what she meant. Fear of change. Fear of accountability. "Then let's make it clear," he said, stepping forward. He turned toward the entire staff, raising his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "Listen up." Silence fell instantly. Every head turned. Every pair of eyes locked onto him. Michael met their gazes one by one. "This business changes today," he said, his voice calm, certain, unshakable. "I don't care who you are or how long you've been here. Everyone gets treated with respect. Customers, employees, delivery drivers, everyone." A few workers shifted uncomfortably. Michael let the silence stretch before speaking again. "I'm not interested in fake apologies. I don't want anyone sucking up to me. I want real change. You want to keep your job here." His gaze swept across the room. "Then prove it." The weight of his words settled over them. No threats, no ultimatums, just a simple fact. Change or leave. That was it. Jason swallowed hard. Carl stared at the floor. Michael nodded once. Back to work. And just like that, the moment ended. But the message had been received. Loud and clear. An unexpected visitor. As Michael turned back toward the reception desk, a new voice cut through the air. Quite a speech. Michael glanced up. Standing in the doorway was a man in a tailored gray suit, his expression unreadable, his sharp eyes locked onto Michael. For the first time today, the employees weren't the ones who looked nervous. Rachel, visibly tense beside him. Michael studied the man. "And you are?" The stranger smirked slightly. "I think you know." And just like that, Michael did. Because he had seen this man's name before. On the contract. On the ownership papers. On every legal document related to this business. This was the man who had owned Crystal Shine before him. And from the look on his face, he wasn't happy about losing it. The clash begins. The room felt tighter now. Michael didn't move. The former owner stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the tile. "Michael Williams," he said, voice smooth. "I've been hearing some interesting things." Michael kept his expression neutral. "I'm sure you have." The man folded his hands behind his back. "You've certainly made a statement today. Firing Tony, putting your foot down, restructuring everything." Michael tilted his head slightly, and the smirk faded slightly. "And I'm wondering if you understand what you're doing." Michael exhaled slowly. "Enlighten me." The man took another slow step forward. "You're running an elite auto spa," he said, "not some feel-good charity. You can't treat this place like a regular business. It thrives on exclusivity, prestige, power." Michael remained silent. The man smiled thinly. "And the kind of people who spend thousands on a simple car wash, they don't want to feel like they're in the same place as just anyone." Michael felt his jaw tighten slightly. Oh, there it was. The same toxic belief system that had trickled down to Tony, to Jason, to Carl. The idea that value was determined by status. That respect was a privilege, not a given. Michael's fingers curled slightly at his sides. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was about proving a point. "That mentality," Michael said quietly, "is exactly why this place needed a new owner." The former owner's smirk vanished. Michael stepped forward, matching the man's gaze. "I didn't buy this business to cater to arrogance. I bought it to make it better. To make it something that treats people like people." The man scoffed. "And you think that'll keep your clients?" Michael's eyes didn't waver. "I don't think. I know." The man studied him. For the first time, his confidence wavered. Because Michael wasn't rattled, wasn't second-guessing, wasn't afraid. He was certain. And there was nothing more powerful than that. Finally, the man exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Guess we'll see how long you last." Michael's expression remained calm. "Guess we will." With one last look, the former owner turned on his heel and strode out the door. The moment he was gone, Rachel let out a breath she'd clearly been holding in. "That guy gives me the creeps," she muttered. Michael watched the door for a moment longer. Then he nodded to himself. The real fight had just begun, and he was ready. The weight of the former owner's words still hung in the air long after he had left. Michael stood near the front desk, hands resting in his pockets, watching the employees move around the shop. They were working, but there was a new energy in the air, one laced with unease. They had all heard the conversation, and though none of them said it out loud, Michael could feel their silent question pressing in on him. Would his way really work? Or was he about to drive this place into the ground? Michael exhaled slowly. He had come too far to turn back now. Then the door swung open, and a new kind of tension filled the room. A customer had arrived. Not just any customer. A high-profile one. The test begins. Every eye in the shop snapped toward the entrance. A man in a custom-tailored suit stepped inside, his expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor. His Rolex gleamed, and his dark sunglasses reflected the overhead lights as he glanced around, unimpressed. Behind him, two more men followed, both dressed in matching suits, their posture screaming security detail. But it was the car outside that really made the statement. A deep blue Bugatti Chiron sat parked near the entrance, its sleek body gleaming under the California sun. The moment the employees saw it, the energy in the room shifted. This wasn't just any customer. This was Dominic Carter, billionaire, venture capitalist, a man who had made headlines for both his ruthless business tactics and his extravagant lifestyle. And now he was here. Michael didn't move as Dominic strolled forward, his movements slow, deliberate. He reached the reception desk and took off his sunglasses, revealing piercing blue eyes that looked at people the way a lion looked at prey. "Who's in charge here?" he asked, his voice smooth, yet carrying an edge of expectation. Michael stepped forward. "I am." Dominic's eyes flicked to him, scanning him the way one might examine a piece of furniture. "You're the new owner?" "That's right." Dominic tilted his head slightly. "Well then, let's see if you're worth my time." The challenge. Dominic placed his car key on the counter, tapping it lightly. "I want full premium detailing. Everything. Top to bottom." Michael nodded. "No problem." Dominic smiled slightly, leaning in. and I expect a certain level of discretion. Michael's gaze didn't waver. Meaning? Dominic smirked. Let's just say I don't like people talking about my business. Michael let the silence stretch before answering. That won't be an issue. Dominic studied him for a second longer. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the lounge area, his bodyguards following closely behind. The moment he was out of earshot, Jason let out a low whistle. That guy's a big deal, he muttered under his breath. Carl, still shaken from the events of the morning, nodded. Yeah, and he's got a reputation. If we screw this up, he didn't finish the sentence. Michael turned to the team. Then let's not screw it up. For the next 30 minutes, the entire shop moved with precision. Every employee worked carefully, meticulously. The Bugatti was handled like a sacred artifact, polished and detailed with the highest level of skill. Michael watched, arms crossed. He could tell that even though the workers were nervous, they were focused. And for the first time, he saw it. A shift. Not just fear of losing their jobs, but pride. Pride in their work. Then, just as they were finishing, Dominic returned. He walked toward the car, his expression unreadable. Carl stepped back nervously. Jason clenched his jaw. Dominic ran a hand over the hood, inspecting every inch. His fingers trailed along the door handle, the polished rims, the flawless interior. Then, finally, he stepped back and turned to Michael. His face gave nothing away. Michael waited. Then a slow smile. Impressive, Dominic said. Didn't think you'd pull it off. The employees exhaled in relief. Michael simply nodded. We take our work seriously. Dominic studied him. Good. Because I don't waste my time on amateurs. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a black card, placing it on the counter. I'll be back next week. Keep the standard this high, and I'll bring you more business. Michael took the card but didn't look at it. Instead, he met Dominic's gaze. We don't change our standards for anyone, he said. That includes you. Dominic paused. For a moment, something unreadable flickered across his face. Then, to Michael's surprise, he laughed. All right, Dominic said, shaking his head. I like you. With that, he grabbed his keys, slid into his Bugatti, and drove off. The employees watched in stunned silence. Then Jason muttered, Holy... Carl smacked his arm. Michael turned to the team. No one spoke. Then, slowly, a ripple of energy moved through them. Jason grinned. Carl let out a breath of relief. The workers looked at each other, and for the first time, they saw themselves differently. Not as the arrogant, exclusive elite. Not as the gatekeepers of prestige, but as a team. A real one. A place where skill mattered more than status. Michael watched, arms still crossed, as the weight of the day settled into place. This wasn't the same shop from this morning. And it never would be again. Rachel turned to him. You did it, she said softly. Michael exhaled, a small smile touching the corner of his lips. We did. Epilogue. The legacy begins. 1 week later, Crystal Shine Auto Spa was busier than ever. Not just with wealthy clients, but with all kinds of people. The garage felt different. More alive. More open. Jason and Carl worked harder than they ever had. Rachel's confidence had grown. And Michael sat in his office, looking out at the business he had rebuilt. His phone buzzed. A message from Greg, the district director. Whatever you're doing, keep it up. Numbers are skyrocketing. And that Carter guy, he's been talking about you to other VIPs. Looks like you proved your point. Michael chuckled to himself. Yeah, he had. He leaned back in his chair, watching as the team moved across the garage floor, working, laughing, moving as one. This was only the beginning. But one thing was clear. Respect wasn't just given. It was earned. And Michael, he had earned it.